Hey everybody. Today I want to talk about detritus worms in our aquariums. I've come to find out recently that a lot of people seem to think about detritus worms at best nuisances, but at worst and inaccurately as parasites in our aquarium. And nothing could be further from the truth. So hopefully by the end of this video I'm going to have you convinced that detritus worms are nothing to be feared. In fact, you will love your detritus worms and you will hopefully appreciate your detritus worms because they're really an important part of our aquarium's ecosystem. I know it's a closed system and we have to do certain things that nature can't provide for in a closed system, but the more natural we can have the system and the more aspects of a natural process we can recapitulate or mimic within our aquarium, the better off it's going to be. And detritus worms are all part of that good, healthy, functioning aquarium biome. Detritus worms in your substrate are the equivalent to having earthworms in your garden. They're just in there breaking down waste products and turning them into basically gardener's gold. It's basically turning it into the end result of the decomposition process. And in a garden you would think of that as compost, but in our aquariums we think of that as mulm. The faster you can turn waste products, whether it's uneaten fish food or fish poop, which in a sense is partially digested uneaten fish food, little bits of leaves and stuff that break off of the plants, little dead bits of whatever that drop to the bottom of the tank, all of that stuff needs to be broken down and turned into essentially compost. But again, in our aquariums we refer to that compost as mulm. That's M-U-L-M if you're wondering how that's spelled. I know a lot of people get the spelling on that one confused, but it's M-U-L-M if you want to look up mulm and all of its wonderful benefits that it can have in your aquarium. But the faster we can turn that detritus into mulm, the better. And detritus worms do just that. They are detritivores. They eat detritus. They eat all of that little garbagey stuff that falls to the bottom of the tank. And so having a good, healthy amount of them in your substrate is good. It's what you want. It's a plus. It's a positive for your aquarium. Now, how they get in the aquarium is a little bit of a mystery. They just seem to appear in people's tanks, and almost every tank out there will have them, even tanks that don't have substrate, bare bottom tanks, or very shallow gravel substrate. They just get in people's tanks. Even people that don't have plants or woodwork or whatever, just have very stark tanks, will often find that they still get detritus worms floating around and swirling in the water. If the worms have nowhere to go, no substrate to burrow down into, then they're just going to be on the glass, or they may be growing in your filter. They just get in fish tanks. They hitchhike on fish, they hitchhike on birds, they hitchhike on gravel, they hitchhike on aquarium equipment. They just find a way into people's tanks. And so it's very, very common for these to be in your aquarium, whether you realize them or not. So they're very easy to identify. We'll talk about what they look like a little bit. They do get confused sometimes with planaria, but planaria are definitely a nuisance and a pest and potentially hazardous in your aquarium, so you do not want planaria in your aquarium. And the planaria are very easy to distinguish. We'll have a look at them first. Planaria is going to be a flatworm. It's usually going to be seen flat against the glass, and it has a very, very noticeable arrowhead shaped head on it. You cannot miss the very, very pointy shape of the arrow shaped head. That is a distinct feature of the planaria. The way they move is by undulation. They'll basically stretch their body out and move their head away from their tail, and then they'll squinch their tail up close to their head again, and then they'll move their head away from their tail, and then they'll bring their tail up against their head again, and they move in this undulating fashion across the glass. So that is planaria. Very, very easy to identify once you know what you're looking at. Again, that arrowhead shaped head is going to be your key feature to look for. They only get centimeter or two long. They're very small, so you may need assistance looking at them. Zoom in with your camera or something and you'll be able to get a better look at them. The detritus worms, on the other hand, are round worms, not flatworms, and as such they just almost look like little wriggly pieces of spaghetti in your tank. They're about an inch long at their maximum length, or 2.5 centimeters, and they just sort of wriggle and writhe and wriggle all over the place. You may see them stuck to your glass, but they're not going to move in any kind of undulating fashion. They're just going to kind of wriggle around, and they do not have any distinct head end on them. They're just sort of a tube of whitish or tannish color, and there's no real distinct head on them. They're just a tube. It looks like a little piece of spaghetti. So very, very easy to identify the detritus worms. A lot of times you will see them coming up out of the soil or the substrate, whatever you've got in the bottom. It'll almost look like roots or something growing up out of the soil, like maybe white hair growing up out of the soil. You will see that sometimes first thing in the morning, usually when you turn the lights on. Sometimes you will see them when you first turn the lights on, and you'll see them either on the glass or you'll see them swirling around in the water column. And within half an hour or so, the lights coming on, they'll all be gone. And they've just gone to ground. They've worked their way down into the substrate, the same way night crawlers come out at night, and when the day comes, they all burrow back down into the ground and go back underground. So that's where the aspect of appreciating your detritus worms comes into play. You should love your detritus worms for what they actually do in your aquarium. They do great things for your aquarium. They really help it function and stay healthy. So you should love your detritus worms for what they're actually doing in your aquarium. The reason you should appreciate your detritus worms is for what they can tell you about your aquarium. If you've got a nice healthy setup, everything's running well, you're not having excess amounts of mulm or detritus rather, you're not having excess amounts of detritus buildup, you've got plenty of water circulation, good oxygen exchange, gas exchange. If your tank's functioning well, then you shouldn't even notice these detritus worms. You should not see them in the morning when you turn the lights on. You shouldn't see them on the glass. You shouldn't see them floating around the water. A nice healthy tank will have a balanced amount of the detritus worms. They'll simply be in the soil, and you'll probably never even know they're there unless maybe you do some gravel vacuuming and you see a few of them occasionally, or you're digging to bury a plant. You're planting a new plant, you dig into the substrate a little bit. You might see them then, but otherwise you're probably not going to see these detritus worms at all in a nice, healthy, fully functioning system. Where that comes into play is when things aren't so healthy, when you're getting a little slack on your maintenance, or you're feeding a little too much, or maybe your tank's overstocked and the fish poop's piling up and you're not keeping on top of it. That's when you're going to start to see the detritus worms build up. That's when you're going to see an explosion of their population, and that's when you see them in the morning when the lights come on and they're on the glass and they're swirling around in the water. If you're seeing that, that's a very, very early warning sign that you're not keeping up with the maintenance on your aquarium. You need to step up your game. You need to do better water changes, better vacuuming. You need to consider your stocking density. You need to think about how much you're feeding. Maybe possibly add an air stone. If you've got low oxygen levels in the water, that can bring them up to the surface a lot of times. And so I think of them as what I basically consider them sort of a canary in the coal mine sort of species. Snails are another good one. When you have snails in your tank, having snails in your tank is fine. They'll stay in check. There'll be a normal population of snails. You'll just have some snails around your tank. It's when you start to see snails growing all over everything and you got an infestation of snails, that's simply letting you know that you're not keeping up on your maintenance. If it wasn't for seeing these early warning signs, these canaries in the coal mine, like the explosion of the snail population or the explosion of the detritus worms, if you weren't seeing that, then you wouldn't really realize you're getting so lax on your maintenance. And the first signs of that are going to be fish disease and fish dying. And you don't want that. You want something that's going to let you know that something's amiss before tragedy strikes. So the detritus worms are a very early warning sign. You will start to see an explosion of detritus worms long before the water conditions get so bad that you start noticing problems with your fish. But seeing those detritus worms lets you know that, all right, I got to think about, why am I seeing all these detritus worms? Am I overfeeding it? Is it overstocked? It could be a combination combination of all the reasons we've talked about, but an excess amount of food, just like for the snails, an excess amount of food is going to cause a population explosion. And so that is a nice, good early warning sign for you to realize you need to make some changes to your aquarium. Now, that's not to say that that's a fail-safe. As long as you're not seeing those worms, everything is fine. You still need to keep an eye on your pH and your water hardness, and all the other water parameters still need to be right for your fish. You can't just rely on, well, I don't see, snails, or I don't see detritus worms, so everything must be fine. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm simply saying that if you do see an explosion of snails, or you do see an explosion of detritus worms, that's an early warning sign. There's a lot of things in our aquarium that might be considered an early warning sign. If you smell your aquarium and it smells a little funny, it smells a little off, that's an early warning that something's going amiss possibly, or something's changing within your tank. So don't rely on that, but just keep that as sort of, in your mental toolbox of things to take note of. If you notice an explosion of these detritus worms, or you see a lot of them, start thinking about why you're seeing so many of them. You may need to step up your game in the aquarium hobby. So as far as having them in your tank, they are an absolute bonus. They are a plus. It's desirable. You want them in your tank. They are far, far from a nuisance. Again, I can see where people would call them a nuisance if you've got an explosion of them, but that explosion of them is your early warning sign. Again, I see that as like an alarm bell. And when you have an explosion of them, it's really easy to get on top of it. You just step up your maintenance and do some gravel vacking, get the crap out of the tank, step up the circulation a little bit, and like that, I was supposed to snap there, just like that, they'll be gone. You'll just get rid of them, and you'll never get rid of them, but you'll get them back into check, and you'll get them back to where you're not seeing them anymore. But trust me, you probably have detritus worms in your aquarium, especially if it's a long established aquarium. I almost guarantee you've got detritus worms in there, and you want that. You want them to be in your tank. They are a good thing. You should love your detritus worms, and you should also appreciate your detritus worms. So that's my 2 cents on that. I would love to hear your thoughts on the topic, whether you've always thought they were parasitic or dangerous or whatever. But if you've changed your opinion and you've changed how you feel about them, I would certainly love to hear that too, because I always like when I'm able to have an impact on the way people think about their aquariums or whatever, and they get a little less stressed out about things that aren't really problematic, that they might be led to believe are problematic from other people. But trust me, those detritus worms are not problematic. In fact, they even serve as food sources and natural forage for some types of fish. Not all of them, but some types of fish will eat those detritus worms. So it's even a good natural food and forage source within your tank. Again, the more natural we can keep our aquarium, the better we are, and detritus worms are a very, very natural part of breaking down all that waste and keeping our tanks nice and healthy and functioning well. So again, leave your thoughts down below. Make sure you subscribe. You don't want to miss anything I got coming up. You never know what it's going to be with me. Don't forget, I do a live stream every Friday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and every Sunday night we do a topic discussion at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. So don't miss that one. Make sure you ring that bell. I'll see you real soon in the next one.